Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 2.13 to 2.16, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 2.13, Soldier of Fortune. Isis just knew that his luck was too good to continue. The Marquis had captured two giants, well, not literal giants, humans, 4 feet tall humans. Nonetheless, they were giants to Isis, and he was supposed to fight them. His fairy fans had already turned against him. The fall of the Goliath, long live the Titans, adorned the walls with a tiny print on the minuscule posters all around the fighting pits. It wasn't enough that they were huge, but he had to fight both, and they were magical adventurers to boot. Isis couldn't forget the absolute look of sadistic joy that the Marquis held when he announced the fight. He had 3 choices. First, risk trying to run away. That would probably end with his death. Second, try to win the fight, and that would probably end with his death. Third, convince the humans to escape with him. That would probably end with his death, but less probably than the other 2. After weighing his options, his choice was obvious. He began sobbing, "Isis is not fair." He wiped the snot from hole somebody being polite would refer to as a nose. Why does Isis always get the short stick? Isis is kind, Isis is useful. So why is Isis being treated so unfairly? Do gods hate Isis? Or maybe they find Isis suffering funny, and Isis' life to the death is a joke to them. "Keep it down," shouted the cage-keeper. "I'm allowed to be upset," he mumbled, scratching his leathery skin. Isis sat upon the dirty cage floor and crossed his arms in thought. If he couldn't rely on any of the obvious paths to survive, then he would need to rely on the only other thing he could: random chance. After all, that was what got him into this mess in the first place, and definitely nothing to do with his personality or decision-making, or continually taunting the Marquis at every time he won a fight. Going so far as to moon him at one point. Just bad luck. Somewhere in the middle of the dreaming up a good happenstance, Isis fell asleep but continued his dreams. He was jostled awake by the dumping unceremoniously into the dirt of the fighting pit. His mace was tossed beside him, missing his head by inches. Think lucky thoughts, he reminded himself. The Titans descended into the arena, manifestations of death and destruction. "Nathan, it's a bit small, isn't it?" asked the female Titan. "We shouldn't underestimate it, Annabelle. Who knows what's capable of?" remarked Nathan. "It's pretty ugly," Annabella agreed. The spark of micro-drums and the minute trumpets signaled the arrival of the Marquis. He was accompanied by his daughter, adorned with too much jewelry and appearing nervous. She stood beside him and sat upon his delicate throne, smug satisfaction radiating from him. He pointed at Isis and said, "Kill it." "Titans! Titans! Titans!" chanted the crowd. "You can do it, Goliath," the Marquis's daughter shouted, to the glare of her father. Isis's chest swelled with pride. He hadn't known he had a fan left. He picked up his mace and screamed and charged towards the Titans. Mana in that moment flowed through him, every ounce that he collected through his service to the dungeon. His speed, strength, and hope surged. He dashed forward between Nathan's legs and planted the weapon into his heel. Frack! Nathan fell. Dodging the falling Titan, Isis then leapt high, beating his wings with a furious force. Annabella was already spinning around, swinging her sword. Isis flew higher still, having avoided her blade by the flake of a skin. He swung into her face, and in that moment witnessed a stray tooth flung from her jaw. She stumbled, but rushed back towards him, less using her sword and more her entire body in a blind anger. Nathan began to rise. It was the best opportunity that Isis would get. He turned and flew away, directly toward the Marquis. "Die!" Isis screamed, raising his weapon, surprise flashing in the Marquis's eyes. Zap! Isis spasmed into the dirt. His world had gone blank for a moment, a white void full of smell of frying pork. The Marquis sighed as he adjusted the ring on his finger. "Did you really think that would work, you pathetic creature?" Isis gurgled. The Marquis then glared towards the Titans. "I look forward to breaking you 2 useless tools." Then he raised his ringed fingers towards Isis. "Daddy," the daughter said, "please don't kill Goliath." She grabbed his arm. He turned his glare towards her. "You expect me to spend someone who threatened my life?" No, this is what rulers must do, Tillarum. You must learn. Tillarum bit her lip, eyes shaking. The Marquise responded with no emotion. Then she nodded and said, I understand, and she let go of his arm. Excellent, Can I kill him? She asked. Her words sent a second shock through Isis, and his condition worsened. The Marquise gave a genuine smile. Of course, sweetie, and he plucked the ring from his finger, handing it to her. Make sure you aim it at his head, anywhere else and it might make a mess. Oh, I remember my first kill. Tillarum slipped it on and aimed towards Isis, and she said, I'm sorry, and let loose the lightning at her father's throne, blowing it to bits. Nobody move or you get fried. The Marquis coughed and began pulling himself from the rubble, the shimmering of a magic shield around him as the necklace glowed. Tillarum flew down to Isis, and with a tiny hand slapped him. Get up, Goliath, we're leaving. He didn't feel it. At that moment, he didn't feel much of anything, except the desire to comply and frustration at his inability to do so. She pointed at the Titans. You two, you want to leave too, right? I know a way out. Grab Goliath and come with me. Nathan was limping and Annabelle was rubbing her jaw, but they didn't argue. Annabella grabbed Isis and flung him over her shoulder with enough force that Isis could feel again, though mostly it was just pain. The Marquis had dug himself out. Tillarum, you! He slammed into a tree when she launched another blast of lightning at him. I hate you, Dad. You never let me do anything. It's all rules this and kill that, and you'll die outside. Well, guess what? I can do whatever I want, and I'm going to go on a grand and noble adventure with my new friends. And you can't stop me. An earring on the Marquis flashed, and he was covered in a green light, recovering him entirely. He hovered in front of the tree and pointed his guard's command. Stop her. Tillarum looked at Annabella and said, Let's go, now. They ran as dragonflies began to buzz. Why don't you shoot lightning at them? Nathan asked, wincing with each time his right foot touched the ground. She crossed her arms. I'm not going to kill anybody. That's not what noble adventurers do. Annabella and Nathan exchanged a glance. Annabella asked, can you at least shoot lightning at some trees? Try to slow them down. Okay. Then the forest was on fire. Oh no! What if somebody burns up? Tillarum asked, worried. You did perfect, like a real noble adventurer, Annabella said. Really? Tillarum asked, grasping her hands together, eyes sparkling. Oh yes, Nathan agreed. After all, we're noble adventurers too. I knew it! She laughed. The tiny sounds of screaming Fae echoed through the burning woods. Are you sure? Yes, Annabella and Nathan said in unison. They ran and ran and ran until nightfall, and when the light on the far-off fire had extinguished. By that point, Isis had long recovered his movements and feelings, though still injured. Though still on Annabella's shoulder, he guided the group with an ability to see in the dark. Here looks safe, he said. Finally, said Nathan, plopping to the ground and gently touching the blood-caked foot. We should gather some herbs if we can, then I can make a poultice to help our wounds. I can do that, shouted Tillarum. Shh, stay quiet if you can, Annabella said. Tillarum whispered something that they couldn't hear. Annabella said, not quite that quiet. And then she looked around. I want you to stay here with Nathan, just in case. I'll have Goliath guide me to gather some plants. I can do that, she said. Nathan, what do you need? Bronconfoot leaf. It's a greenish-blue color and should grow near water. But be careful. It's covered with thorns. Any sort of root of a magical flower, which will be harder to find. Oh, and anything fibrous or flexible, so that I can weave a bowl. All right, make a small fire if you can while we're gone, Annabella said. The Isis marched further through the woods. Isis careful to remember the path that they were taking. He took the opportunity to say, My name is not Goliath. What is it? No, Isis. So it's Goliath. No, my name is Isis. That strange name. Then again, you're a strange creature. A strange, ugly, smelly creature. Is this true? Annabella laughed. I haven't forgiven you for my tooth, though. When we make it back to the city, I'm selling you to buy a replacement. I think that would be a lucky outcome for me, Isis said. He didn't have much energy to argue his eventual fate. He was alive for the moment, and for that he was grateful. He then heard the running water. Go left, he told her. The bronconfoot leaf was easy to find and harvest, though Annabella did prick herself a few times in the dark. It was another hour of wandering before they came across a magical plant, though they gathered plenty of fibrous stalks along the way. When they returned to the camping spot, Telerum was crying, and exhaustion covered Nathan's face. "It's not fair," Telerum sobbed. "Nathan, what's going on?" Annabella asked as she handed him the plants. "She's upset that we don't have a lavish meals prepared for her, or a comfortable bed," he said with marked emotion, "and that she's dirty, and that she's tired, and that her wings hurt." He rubbed his foot. "I understand your pain," Isa said to Telerum. She sniffed. "Really? I've experienced the streams of discomforts many times. It is temporary. Somehow you always find your way back to something comfortable in the end," he said, not mentioning that to find your way back to discomfort just as often, if not more. "Okay," she said. "If Goliath can handle it, then so can I." Annabella plucked Isis from her shoulder and dropped him into the ground. "How? How? Why?" he asked. She said, "I already told you. You stink." He did not respond. He lay there painfully wheezing, but alive. That was pretty lucky. End of chapter. Chapter 2.14 Into Chaos. Avery descended the steps into a palatial manor in the evening gown of a scintillating amber, the upper hem fastened up beneath the slender shoulders in a ring of honey calcite stones. As she did, she couldn't help but notice the guards for her carriage were lying sprawled across the courtyard, broken, bloody, and beaten. The giant homunculus, three-eyed with grey flesh, stood above them. Traces of red clung through its sledgehammer fists. The strongest of her guards could still stand, barely and awkwardly, without the usual pompous rigour, ashamed like schoolboys to have been beaten. The longest-serving of them, although she couldn't recall his name, straightened up and saluted her. "There's, somebody already inside, ma'am," he said, nodding towards the carriage. "He said he wanted to speak with you. We tried to stop him, but, I see." Fire engulfed her hand, and the burning away of the long evening glove. Ember-lined ash dripped from her fingers as she strode towards the homunculus. Its dull face bore no reaction. "Ma'am," the guard called out, "he had a symbol of the white lily." She froze. Her hand curled into a fist, extinguishing her fires and curls of smoke. "Here, already? I see." She kept a long string of curses silent but implied. Opening the door, she clambered inside to plush-lined compartment. Sitting on the bench seat opposite where she settled was an old man, his skin as dark as teak, his beard carved into a perfect pyramid coming off his chin. A circlet of 3 arcane runes adorned his brow. Hanging from his neck by a golden chain was a small glass vial, no bigger than his thumb, the bottom full of the dark soil that nested a petite white blossom. And yet the little flower was precious enough to overturn Calturn, the budding of the immortal lily, the source of Avery's own longevity, and, oh, an addictive little bastard. Her fingers trembled at the sight of the precious flower, restraining the urge to snatch it from the man's skinny neck. He smiled. "Avery, how good of you to meet me like this." "I didn't expect the guilds to arrive for another month," she admitted. "Will the Order of the White Lily be laying claim to the dungeon?" No, you misunderstand. No, the Damphor will have their turn with this one." He clicked his tongue, like a schoolteacher with a din pupil. "Let us be clear. I am not here for the guild. I am not here for the dungeon. I'm here only because my dear, ill-fated student, Olin, is tragically deceased. As soon as his life sign shattered, I came rushing over." A likely story, she smiled thinly, allowing him his lie. "But since I'm here, and since the dungeon is likely responsible for his death," a little shrug, a little grin, poaching from the Damphor, it was a kind of audacious scheme that she'd expect from the man who raised Olin. "Cal Logroth, Olin talked about you. At your service." There was a groan as the back of the homunculus stepped aboard the footman's step. He rapped on the carriage's ceiling, signaling the coach driver to take off. "You know, I was a little institute first, examining the scene. I met a young man named Malvert, with lovely things to say about you." She froze. The carriage cabin suddenly too small, claustrophobically small. Not now. Not him. Not somebody with enough status to actually bring consequences down on her for her schemes. Olin favored him, I suppose. He wants to fill Olin's shoes. Olin's bed sheets, you mean? The chuckle from the old man was so dry that she wouldn't be surprised if the dust flew from his lips, if he coughed up some ancient shard of stone. No, he really was quite complimentary, infatuated with you. He didn't even break when I confronted him about this. From his robes he withdrew a tiny diamond-shaped vial. A low drop of brilliant azure settled at the bottom. She almost considered playing dumb, but then she was so sick of playing. I'm not sure why these matters interest you. It's shameless, the old man declared. A dirty, low-down trick poisoning poor innocent adventurers. Vicious, ruthless, sneaky, underhand. And word by word the smile came over his face until he sighed and leaned back, shoulders slumping, his eyes growing hazy with nostalgia. Ah, Olin came up with it, didn't he? That boy really did always have to surprise us for me. He was surprisingly reliable in one way. The fear of her chest slowly settling from the panicked vivacisimo to a mere allegro tempo. She tried to follow the old bastard's mercurial mood. A real upstart, but we all shouldn't talk about him as if he's not here. Reaching into his pockets again, he fished out another vial. This one was full of a yellowish clear solution, and in it floated a little toe, perfectly manicured. Is that a little memento of my dear student, held in case he ever got himself into too much trouble? Do you have any capable revivalists amongst the little town? We can send for one. Avery suffered the light of her city without comment, consumed by the sudden thought that she might actually see Odin again. She couldn't wait to strangle the life back out of him. The gladness mingled with relief she felt, the old man's unspoken but clear message being that he'd not reveal her schemes as long as she added in his. And suddenly, despite herself, she was laughing. Some little joke Olin had made long ago was suddenly so funny again that it made the little bell trills of laughter fall from her lips. Gods, she probably loved him. That was embarrassing. And in the background a bell rang out, joining her sudden fit of laughter. The 3 notes had swept away her sudden joy and replaced it with dread. It was a deep, ominous sound of iron, a dull clanging that brought the mind of thundering hooves of cavalry charge. Avery stiffened, catching herself, and the man followed her sudden change of mood with a look of abject confusion. What? That was the usurper's bell. It means enemies within the city, ill rule, disaster. Without waiting for his response, she opened up the carriage door, peering out. There was smoke in the distance, and they were heading right for it. "Coachman," she called out. "Faster." It was as bad as it could be expected. The wards around Sufi's mansion had been taken down for the occasion, and now smoke billowed out of the grand doors and broken apart. Fire was catching along the upper floors, coming darting out at shuttered windows their bright tongues. Already the blaze was producing a stifling rain of ash and ember, rolling out from the great pillar of smoke from the rising overhead. Steel rang, and shouts, screams, all echoed beneath the clanging. "Give me your whip," Avery demanded of the coachman, grasping the cold leather in the hand as she strode inside. Bodies littered the foyer. A token force of dwarves was holding a grand staircase with a perfected around the statue of Halfdan's grand ancestor, stabbing with the halberds as raged wild men fought their way steadily upwards. Avery lifted her whip and lashed out through the air. A single rivulet of flame from her bare fingers ran down the length and expanded to the moment of the crack sounded out, exploding into a burst of fire that made the air ripple with a heated movement, the concussive blast ripping through the men and the stairwell and sending them stumbling. Again and again she drove the men with air bursts of powerful flame, not singling out any one of them, but herding the lot with shockwaves from each crack of the whip. The dwarves lunged forward, spearing the invaders with driving them back. One of the men turned, managing to get his bearings for a split second, and rushed towards Avery. With a sneer of contempt, she wrapped the whip around his neck and ignited it to a brilliant orange, turning the whip into a molten collar and seared the flesh of the throat to a charred nothing. She tossed the whip aside, a ragged bit of cinder, and she lifted up a sword from the man's corpse and was ready, crumbling to a fine, feathery ash. The men on the stairwell were dead or dying, the dwarven guard triumphant, wiping the sweat from their brows. The old man entered behind her, his enormous homunculus looming behind him. The idle way he walked told Avery that he wouldn't be in no hurry to help today. "Where is Sufi?" she demanded. "She should be in the parlor," the captain huffed out, the wound across his brow staining blood down one half of his face like a strange war paint. We'll be right along behind you." She wasn't waiting. She lunged forward, rushing up the steps and vaulting over the corpses. In the parlor, the best of the best, the private guards of the richest nobles in Colton, had come to heat against the wild men. The tables of delicate foods had overturned, the marble slick with bread pooling. The gold and swordsman uniforms flashed away as they cleaved through the savage horde. They were good, but their opponents were mad as dogs. And if a man was ready to die, it was hard to keep him from taking at least one life with him. They impaled themselves willingly on blades to reach for their opponents, to gouge out their eyes and slit their throats. The casualties lay thick on the floor. Just 3 men held up the parlor center now, each of them drenched in red. The only thing left clean were their swords, flashing through the air so quickly that the blood couldn't cling to them. Arcs of silver dancing as the 3 held back 8. To the right, Cathara was leading her dwarves to fight a losing battle with the ceremonial axes, outnumbered and outfought. To the left was Kedlin, of all people, sweaty and out of place amongst the blood-soaked guard, but valiantly gesturing with his sword stick for everyone else to fight harder. She snorted. He would put someone's eye out with that thing. Fire blazed down her arm and engulfed her blade, and she swept into the fight at the center. Her head toppled instantly as she came rushing in from the rear, killing one before she could react, and putting the remaining wild man behind her as the swordmaster. It was hardly a struggle. The moment she locked blades with the Ash Warrior, the swordsman ran him through from behind. Just like that, the deadlock broke. The man nodded to Avery, his greying hair pasted to his thin, bony face with sweat, and then he darted off to help another swordsman. The battlefield rolled in the favor of Avery, charged into Kedlin's skirmish. It was ugly here. Men fought standing over corpses, a mixture of blood and ash thick in the air. Avery killed 2 before having a bulk of the ashen horde could turn its attention to her. And then she was nearly swept away. Swords and axes, makeshift spears, all of them sought for her blood. Avery ignited, like a blazing star. She lifted a dome of flame around her and burned the men of ash away, controlling the flame and drawing it into a spiral. When it was done, when there were nothing more but bones crackling open on the heat, the marrow sizzling away in the fleshy gouts of steam, she let go, drawing the fire back and down into the blazing layer over her skin. The marble was cracked like an earthquake had hit, the edges of the spidering cracks dripping with molten heat. Much of Kedlin's guard was dead too, a sad byproduct. One man of wild horde was still alive, impossible to burn, clothing all reduced to a black soot that clung to his skin, a blazing blue ember glowing in the ebbs and falls beneath his chest. "Heretic!" he hissed, gripping his axe and lunging for Avery. Her sword had turned into molten slag. Her fire was no good against an ashen dungeon's chosen, but she could still use other ways. Clapping her hands together, she created a wave of superheated air that rolled forward, throwing the man back a step. He scowled. "A little runt like you? How did you do it?" she spat out. "Ah, so it's not my heresy that has you so angry. It's your jealousy, wondering how I succeeded where you failed." Avery's eyes sparkled. She was like a cat playing with a mouse. With another clap, her hands forced him back, and now the guards were finding their courage, edging forwards behind him. One direction he couldn't take a single step without being forced back, the other he would meet his death. The man hesitated, trapped, and Avery plucked up a sword that had escaped being totally reduced to scrap. "I succeeded for all the same reason that I'll kill you. I'll tell you that much." Infuriated, the man lunged again. At this time, she let him hurtle forward, shoving her blade between his ribs. It just missed the ember at his heart. His axe swept down and gashed her shoulder open, making her scream out, as his weight bore both of them down to the floor. The sword fell from her fingers, still impaled through the chest. Her good hand seized his wrist and held him back from taking another fatal blow, as he ripped the axe free from the wound. Half a dozen swords jabbed into him from behind, but none of them so much as scraped the ember. The sword's points emerged from the other side, nearly stabbing her. He let go of the axe with one hand and seized her throat. Fire coiled around his fingers but could not burn him. She bit him, but it did nothing, not even as she severed his thumb with her teeth and spat it out into his face. The guard seized him, holding him back. She gasped, "His heart, you idiots! His heart!" A shadow fell over her. An enormous homunculus reached out, plucking the man from the crowd's grasp, and crushed him. It was hideous. Nothing Avery had seen in her life had been able to bend bones like putty. It simply smashed him down into a compact, bleeding ball and dropped him onto the floor. It was over. End chapter. Chapter 2.15 The Tides. Trevelyan winced as the guards forced him along, hobbling against the hard, smooth stone of his boot. It was an odd-shaped one, too, jabbing into him every few steps. You know, I've heard the hospitality described as the mother of virtues, and you could really stand to be a bit more gentle, he groused. But you didn't think much of our hospitality now, did you? Cathara reminded him, not looking back his way. That worried him. She seemed like the type to gloat. Oh, he'd gotten himself into it now. He was being led through the dwarven quarter. Grim business. All these statues everywhere, the dead cast into bronze. He'd heard somewhere that there was real bones entombed inside, standing graves smiling as they were alive. It all made him shiver. 2 guards had either one of his arms, marching him down the street as children ran along behind him, eager to see the criminal. Actually, this time Trevelyan wasn't sure what he'd done. They were leading him towards the center of it all, a grand manor. A protective web of spellwork bent to let him through as they displayed badges, and one of the hastily attached to his ragged shirt, pulling him through the golden dome. The scenery started to look all too familiar then. He was led back to the courtyard, into the dark of the solitary tower, down into the winding depths beneath where the rats crept and the walls wept with a faint slime. Classical prison sort of place. Trevelyan knew the scenery well, and one cell amongst dozens he knew very well. This time make sure the guards know his little trick. That door doesn't open except for my say-so, ever, Cathara commanded, before sweeping off. Rough hands pushed him through and slammed the door shut. And then Trevelyan was back at his cell. It was sweet and homely home away from home. The first thing he did once he was thrown inside was pull off his boot and shake the troublesome stone out. Except that it wasn't a stone. A golden watch rolled free of his boot. It was one of those fine, expensive pieces a rich gentleman might wear on his hip. In the end of a gold chain, the silver front was inscribed with a tracework lattice that embossed the shape of a curling ammonite shell. And a voice spoke to him, "Open me, and call forth a guardian 3 times, I will answer." Trevelyan glanced around, nervous that someone else had heard, but it echoed only in his skull. The cell was deadly silent. He froze, hastily tucking the silver trinket back behind his boot as the guard stepped in to pass the bars. The dwarf scoffed, "Like I'm falling for that. Oh, what's the prisoner hiding? Could it be a secret, Trisha? Ooh, I'll open up the door and see." Ha ha! Trevelyan was insulted, like he would try such a Prozac escape. No, the fact was, with his little trick outed and he played no plans, there was nothing to do but wait. Wait for a good time to put the secret little weapon to use. He tucked the watch down into his pocket by his heart, and he'd wait for the gods to provide. Pulling the tricorn hat down over his eyes, he did what often he did while waiting for fortune to arrive. He caught a light nap. It was the sound of clashing steel and dying men that made him come around. Somewhere above, something big was happening. Footsteps echoed down the stairs as the prison tower. "Come on, get a hold of him!" Keys rattled in the lock. Trevelyan lifted his hat to see a trio of dwarves pulling open the door, rough hands seizing him and hauling him from his lazy repose. "Hoof! Heavy! Careful now, lads, I'm a human being, not a sack of tattoos." Smacking his lips as he allowed himself to be hoisted up, hat askew on his head, Trevelyan glanced back with sleep-drenched eyes. "Where are we off to?" "The block." And his blood ran cold. Before he could think to struggle, they had his arms, hauling them behind him as he clapped cold, rigid manacles across his wrists. He was cut off from the watch in his pocket, his sole protection, hands gripping him by either elbow. He was had. "That seems to be a bit extreme, doesn't it?" he chuckled, nervous as a virgin. Everyone was when it came to death. Oh, there were adventurers he knew who'd come back 2 or 3 times, but he never gotten them to give him a straight answer on what it was like. He didn't figure they knew. Even when he had got them drunk enough to talk about anything, they just went misty-eyed and distant. "We ain't taking any chances with you, are we?" "No, sir. We've got a score to settle and a reputation to keep." Trevelyan finally recognized the men on the left. It was the same man that he'd left locked in the cell behind him. That unnecessary touch, if artistic, had just cost him the best chance of bribing his way out. A groan silently passed through his gritted teeth. Step by step, he waited for it, the miracle, the magic summoning that he always wanted to conjure in these moments, and the reason that he would never settle down, never say, "This is enough," no matter what treasure came and went through his hands. Because Trevelyan wasn't enough for himself, was nothing but a comic fool who knew too damn well, except in his most magic moments, those touched by the moon, mid-fool moments where the world clicked into his mind, alighted with the fire of some brilliant scheme, and he wriggled through the narrowest cracks to escape certain death. Those moments. Those precious bits where he seemed half ride and half steer the tide of cosmic luck. Nothing. The tides were leaving him high and dry. He came out into the daylight, and he was the stomp of boots and clatter of swords. On the arcade balcony above, a swordsman dueled to hold back the tide of ragged men. His sword pierced them one by one, as they rushed forward as they fell apart in fluttering ash. There was a block in the courtyard, an old stump, the surface stained with ominous black red that spilled down over the one side. An axe jutted out from the rotting wood. "Looks like they could use your help up there," he tried. "Once we're done here," the dwarf on his right said, his gravelly old voice patient, talking to him like a skittish dog. "Easy does it now." Trevelyan gave up on talking and bucked, trying to rip free of their hands. "You heard him, easy," the left one shouted, and he slammed him into the back of his knee, right where the witch had gotten him too. He slumped forward, and his head made a hard, tooth-rattling impact on the stump's surface. A boot kept onto his back, holding him down. He smelled the blood sunk into the wood, the remnants of others who had gone before, plenty of them, he was sure, waiting for their moment. He saw his sweating reflection in the dull black metal of the axe. But the universe didn't give up on many of those miracle days any more. On the names of Cathara and Sufi Halfhand, leaders of the 7 clans, your death has been ordered by my hands, and it'll be carried out. That hand curled around the axe's handle, and rolled to the side, narrowly dodging a muffled thump as the axe hitting the stump. In moments, breathless, terrified moments, he was on his feet. The young man clawed his face, trying to dislodge the black rat that had sunk its claws into his nose. The old one was staring in confusion. Just as the codger came to his wits and drew his sword, advancing on Trevelyan with a cold sense of duty in his eyes, the doors were bashed open with a riot of unkempt, wild-haired men burst into the courtyard. At the center of the mob they bore 2 sacks of struggling, lumpy burlap. The man's attention wavered between the two, and Trevelyan started running. For lack of anywhere better to run, he went down again, back towards his cell, vaulting down the steps 2 at a time. Boots ranging after him, the old man had stayed behind, and doubtless he'd be dead soon enough for that bravery. But the young one, the one that Trevelyan had humiliated, was storming along behind him with a sword drawn and wagging through the air. "Not this time," he roared, red-faced. "There's nowhere left to run, you fat bastard." A hand grabbed the chains holding his own hands behind his back, and Trevelyan did what he could. He fell down the stairs and yanked the young dwarf with him by dint of superior mass, tumbling and making hard, thudding contact with the sharp edges of every step in the long, rolling spiral. Something gashed his forehead open, and his left arm was wrenched in a sprain, maybe broken, by a funny angled twist that made a hot, sickening pain sear through his arm. And the watch fell free from his pocket, going clink, 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 like a silver wish down the stairs in front of him. He landed in a sprawl, the dwarf landed in a heap. Of the two, Trevelyan was a little quicker, coming around, and he wriggled himself into position, onto his back and lifted his legs, folded under his knees up to his chest, to slip his manacled hands up and under his rump to get them in front of him again. The young guard was climbing to his feet, hand patting across his hips as his sword wasn't there. It was behind Trevelyan. The watch lay 1 step behind him. They slammed into each other and rebounded as they both rushed for their weapon. And Trevelyan's hand touched the watch, maybe a split second before the dwarf's hand touched the sword hilt. The guard spun around, kicking at Trevelyan's throat. The blade rebounded, stopped by the silver mist that poured out from the watch to surround Trevelyan in a protective umbra. For a second, that was all the dwarf's backing away, and sure, his sword pointed quiveringly towards Trevelyan, Trevelyan starting at his own hand with surprise. And then he said, "Well, get him already." The mist leapt forward, taking the shape of a shark that glided through the air. It floated as gentle as a cloud, as silver as starlight, and it surged towards the guards as his face went pale with shock. There was a single enormous jump of the jaws, and a gush of bright blood floated through the shark's half-solid body, forming into a weightless ribbons. Trevelyan felt the tides of luck rolling his way. End of chapter. Chapter 2.16 Through Other Eyes. I watched as Volder retreated back the way he came, flinching back from invisible enemies only he perceived within the gloom, unsettled by the grim beauty of my world, starting to giggle in a high hysteria as the kobold danced around him with a flute, piping away. It was a strange reaction. I wondered if he understood the gravity of his position, if he was the first human to be allowed down into the dark depths to witness my grand creation, that he was the only human allowed to see my creation. Anyone else would have to pay the price of blood and war to reach this far. Blood and war. I felt strangely nauseous at the phrase. With swimming, dizzy thoughts I contemplated if what was all my future held. If I was going to spend the rest of my eternity sinking deeper into the dark and watching the humans claw and fight to unearth me. There were undungeoned thoughts, poisoned thoughts. I banished them, but thoughts banished still remained in the skull, merely driven to some dark corner. And they became tricky and insistent things, always whispering out. It spoke of long eternities with no one to appreciate my work, of seeing the world only through the lens of violence, of becoming warped by it, and at the end of it all, dying in the way of the tomb of Asiatrix had, too much of a threat for the humans to ever allow to live. But these were not my own thoughts. These were poisons dripping in my ear. I turned my attention upwards. The breach that had launched the sunshine into my domain, the wildlife had been completely cleared out wherever the light fell. Archers stood on the other end of the gap, pouring fire down into anything that moved. It was a massacre. As I observed through the ragged edges of my mana cloud where it spilled out through the breach, two of them improvised a tool with a bucket and a rope, trying to fish up a pearl-covered corpse with a juvenile nacre spider that their crude implement. This was humanity. I watched them fumble about until all thoughts of making friends with their kind had been thoroughly disinfected. Still, there was something to be said for company. Yes, I was lonely, but not for a lack of humans. What I needed was some other living being that could appreciate my work. What I needed was a fellow artist. But back to the moment, I had 4 goals. 1, to seize control of the silent market. Even now my rats perched in the ruins, waiting for them to be reborn. It could only be a matter of time. I had dealt the market's reputation a bitter blow, but still, there was money to be made, and money would eventually draw humans like flies to honey. 2, I had been instructed to build a shrine to the Sith, one that would accommodate my gift of the unicorn. Presently, the beast cantered and galloped through the final of the 7 islands, simply happy to be able to move. Feeding from the golden mangroves, the thick manner of the fruit slowly revitalizing the beast, restoring its coat to a sleek gloss and its body to a muscular fullness. 3, I wanted to create an artistic soul, one that could match me. Obichan was close, and with his strange and melancholy temperament, his mystical way of seeing the world, close, but too devoted to me, too much a servant. 4, to intertwine with the human world so that they could no longer destroy me so easily. These could be the one and the same. It was easy to see how the artist and the shrine went together, but it would also be a way to establish the market, an enduring symbol of my strength to reassure them that order would be established out of the chaos born of the night of the white fires, and through the artist I could have a proxy to negotiate with humans. But best of all, I would mean parading the unicorn I'd stolen in front of them all. That was the kind of petty touch that delighted me. If I was going to bind myself to a human world to prevent my own destruction, it would be on my terms, not theirs. I would insinuate myself into their world and addict them to the riches that I could bring. But first, I needed a proxy. I had 4 schemers, the green viper, the somnolent bloom, the sporeback sloth, and the common sewer rat. Thanks to my perfected understanding of each of them, I had more than enough ability to shape them into humanoids. Still, growing and talking and intelligent beings from the mushroom was out, and thus so was left with a somnolent bloom. Snakes, similarly, would take too much effort to give a humanoid form. Every alteration I made multiplied the cost of the next, and giving them arms and legs would make it prohibitively to also offer them increased intellect. Sloths were the closest to human form, but slow, lazy, and dim-witted. Rats had an excellent intellect and a fierce spirit. It was no contest. I conjured a specimen and began to work, flooding my new-made black rat with a manner to bulk him up. Shaking him into a giant by the standards of his species, his forepaws slowly split into lengthening to gain opposable thumbs, and his hindquarters were strengthening to bear him as a biped. As he haunched and curled, his electric currents of raw mana flooded through his being, transforming him harshly without the protective embrace of an evolution chrysalis. I whispered reassurances as I worked, calming him with lullabies that only a dungeon would know. Songs of the cold, reliable earth and the stillness of the air beneath. The slow drip of water dragged trails of sediment and beaded down the stalactite teeth. I shared the fierce pride of my dungeon and the slow regard of the underground world that I had built to soothe him. Soon it was done. In no time I had a rat folk, an almost human beast. I poured what remained of my mana to reserve into expanding his mind. He would be the first, but not their leader of his kind. That honor was reserved. I reached out to Ardent, finding her in the city above. The ashen smell of the battlefield washed through my senses, abrasive compared to the calm of the depths. She was running, fighting, surrounded by a pack. I had turned a blind eye to her efforts surrounding the half-hand villa, not wanting to have to betray her due to my contract with Sufi. Apparently, I had missed quite a lot. For nearly a week, the rats had waited, watching for the dropped badge. A flaw in the defense is a single way to slip through the web of defensive spellwork that guarded the half-hand villa. And then, today, she simply let us in. For the single hour, the wards fell, letting through the carriages and palanquins of the rich, the sumptuous gilded boxes that conveyed them comfort through the filthy streets. Colturn's finest were flocking to the villa for a grand event. My rats came with. The moment the barriers dropped, they were scurrying across the courtyard grounds. My eyes flooded through the underground realm of the cellars, sculleries, kitchens. They skittered on shelves and spice racks as we shooed by maids. But it was the ones who hung back, watching from the rooftops outside the villa, who saw what was truly important. We were not the only guests to come uninvited. They came from the gutters, they came from the alleyways, from every hovel and shadow, clutching cheap swords. Men of ragged clothing poured out, filling up a mob as it swept into the procession of the rich like a knife through butter. The men of Ash were already in the city. Rich carriages were pushed over, set alight as the fine men and women within came screaming out and were butchered by the rusted swords. Footmen were skewered, guards were overrun by sheer numbers. The defensive force of Sufi had set around the perimeter were forced back, stepping over the bodies of the dead as the human tide swept into them. Wherever they went, they lit fires. Torches landed on grass and the ornamental trees. Lamp oil was drenched over men who rushed screaming into a crowd of guards and threw themselves through glass windows to set the house alight with the blazing bodies. These were less human and more living tableau of flesh. 100-handed, spitting flame, a dragon with unwashed masses. We saw everything. The guards retreated into the foyer, up to the grand staircase, Ashmen slipping past them to swarm into the parlor, where the guests stood huddled in fear behind the lost offenders. The arrival of Afri, who blazed through them, fighting fire with fire, all the way to the bitter end. We saw none of that. None of that was the true goal at all, because in all the noise, clamor, our platoon of just 6 had broken away. They moved like they knew where their quarry would be, and they caught Sufi in her chambers, scaling up the walls and smashing through the windows. She wounded one of them with a dagger hidden in her boot, and the other 5 bashed her over the head and threw her in a sack. Her brothers tried to come to her defense, holding a sword that trembled in his hands. For an instant, blue crystals exploded from his skin, armoring him. He was so surprised that he dropped his weapon. A quick thump over the head settled him, and he went into a sack as well. We trailed them through the courtyard, a swarm of rats clambering over the walls and ceilings, ahead and behind the crowd. We saw Trivlin, his head on a stump, waiting for death. Here we finally intervened. A bright claw rap leapt up and ran, scrambling at the man holding Trivelin down, sinking his poison claws into the dwarf's face. The pirate slipped away for a split second, and the axe's fall was halted, capitalizing on the moment of confusion as the man was ash-swept into the courtyard and everything went mad. Like always, he thrives in chaos. Like a fish in water, disaster was simply his element. End of chapter. And that concludes this batch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.